Hello everyone, good morning. I am Callum Marius, the Transport Editor for My London, and I want to welcome you all to this virtual webinar hosted by the Centre for London. It's been a really busy and exciting week for transport in London with the Elizabeth line opening. I've heard the word transformational used a lot. Well, there's something else pretty transformational, e-scooters, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. So our expert speakers are here to discuss how we can use e-scooters to travel sustainably, legally and safely in London. And we also hope to get an exclusive insight into TfL's ongoing e-scooter trials and the latest debate on legalising micromobility vehicles following the announcements made in the Queen's speech. Before we begin, I would like to thank London Travel Watch for generously supporting this event. And I'm going to quickly run through the agenda now and share some tips as how you can best engage with us here on Zoom. Josh Cottel, who is the research manager here at the Centre for London, is going to set the scene for us in terms of their research and advocacy work around micromobility, particularly highlighting key policy recommendations from the Micromobility in London report. And then around 10 past, I'll introduce you to the panel and we'll open up the discussion with initial reactions from various transport and user perspectives. The panel will also have an opportunity to answer some of your questions before the event comes to a close at 11 a.m. So the event is also being streamed publicly on the Centre for London YouTube channel. If you haven't been able to catch us live, you have the opportunity to watch it back afterwards and share the link with others. So if you're doing that, hello. And you can also jump on the YouTube stream if you've got any issues on Zoom. I'd ask if you're watching us on Zoom, please don't use the raise hand function. If you've got something to say during the event, we have a number of options that you can use to engage with us during the session. You can use the chat to share your own reactions and comments, and remember to include your name and organisation when sending a message if you feel comfortable, so everyone knows who you are. And there's a separate Q&A function to submit questions to the panel. And I know that we've got some e-scooter operators who are watching, so hi to all of you, and I'd really like to encourage you to come forward with your questions. I think your input will be really valuable, and I'm sure we'd like to get some more insight into your perspective on the discussion happening here. So please get your questions in nice and early. You can submit them at any point during the webinar. You can also use the thumbs up button to vote for questions you'd like to see asked, and I'll be showing the most popular ones with the panel at the Q&A shortly. Keep an eye also out for some polls that we're running on Zoom during the event. We'd be interested to hear your general opinions around e-scooters, and we're particularly interested around whether you think e-scooters are a good transport solution, because we're really trying to focus on that as well. You can also participate in the conversations and polls happening on Twitter. Use the hashtag or London e-scooters. So that's at the hashtag London e-scooters. So we're going to do the first poll now, and that's just about flashed up on your screens. Let's read it out. So how comfortable do you feel, do you currently feel about e-scooters being part of London's transport system? So not how you feel about, just e-scooters, but how do you feel about them being actually integrated into London's transport system? There are 5 options there: very comfortable, somewhat comfortable, neither comfortable nor uncomfortable, somewhat uncomfortable, or very uncomfortable. So please have your say. I feel like it's Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? Fastest finger first. So we're going to share the results after the initial presentation, which is from Josh from the Centre for London. Josh, over to you.
Thanks very much. I'll just get my slides up. Hopefully you can see that. So thanks for the introduction, Callum. I'm going to be giving a very brief kind of scene-setting presentation about where we are at the moment and some of the recommendations that came out of Centre for London's micromobility report that came out in September last year. I'm Josh Cassell, I'm a research manager at Centre for London. So starting off with some of the opportunities and risks. So e-scooters, like all forms of transport, come with a number of opportunities and risks. And I'm just going to go through some of the headline ones now. On the risk side, without the appropriate kind of regulation and infrastructure in place, we might see, we might be concerned about seeing more collisions on roads and on pavements if more e-scooters were ridden in London. We might also be worried about if there are benefits to riding an e-scooter, such as it being a convenient way of traveling around or a greener way of traveling around, that not all Londoners would have equal access to those benefits. For instance, if they're not in an area where one of the rental schemes is operating, or if they don't have a good quality cycle lane that they could ride in nearby. On the opportunity side, our research suggested that riding an e-scooter offers a number of benefits over other modes of transport, like driving a car or riding in a taxi. So if we saw some people switching some of their journeys away from driving in a car or riding in a taxi towards riding an e-scooter, then we might see, or we'd be very likely to see, reduced carbon emissions, cleaner air, less congestion because they take up much less space on the roads, and indeed safer streets. The evidence that we reviewed for our report suggests that riding an e-scooter is about as safe for riders and for pedestrians as riding a conventional pedal cycle, which makes it a relatively safe form of transport. But whether we are able to make the most of those opportunities and mitigate those risks, we think largely depends on the policies and the infrastructure that we put in place. So I'm just going to talk briefly through some of the recommendations that came out of that report. The first of which is that the government should legalise and regulate privately owned e-scooters. So at present, riding an e-scooter on the roads is only legal via a number of ongoing rental schemes, which are trials. And so we're recommending that privately owned e-scooters be legalized. The evidence suggests that the number of privately owned e-scooters in the UK is many times the number of e-scooters that exist as part of the trials where you can ride them. So they appear to already be here. We recommend regulating them so that people ride them safely. Regulation might involve things like a maximum speed limit or a requirement that lights are used at night. Then we also recommended that governments at local and city level invest in high quality infrastructure. So this might be something like good quality segregated cycle lanes in which e-scooters driving at sensible speeds are able to ride safely alongside bikes. Might also be safe and secure parking for e-scooters, like we want to see for cycles too. And then finally, when we do have rental schemes, because in London we have 32 boroughs, we're recommending that those rental schemes be operated at the city level rather than at the borough by borough level, because if you do have it across those 32 different boroughs, each of them with slightly different rules, or maybe some of them opting in and some of them opting out, that can become very difficult for riders of e-scooters to use. So those are three of our recommendations that came out of our work, and I'm sure we'll hear much more about the policy implications of e-scooters throughout this discussion. And I'm just going to briefly touch on where we are now. So as I mentioned a moment ago, riding an e-scooter on roads in the UK remains legal only via these ongoing trials. Those trials are set to end in November of this year, and we're not yet sure what's going to happen after that. We recently signed an open letter calling for legalisation and regulation of e-scooters. And following the Queen's speech, we have had a recent commitment to legislation being brought forward from the government to Parliament in the 22-23 parliamentary session. We're not yet sure the details of that or what it's going to look like, but for, one thing that we have heard is that it's likely to include a new vehicle class for e-scooters and similar vehicles. I'm sure we'll hear much more about the e-scooter trials. The one in London has been going on since June of 2021, and there have been over 1 million journeys, and 10 boroughs are participating. So that's kind of where we are now, and I'm going to hand back to Callum. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Josh. Absolutely great stuff, and really interesting to put it all in perspective, because we are at a crunch point, really. So with the opportunities and risks there outlined. Let's share the results of the first poll now. So if we can get those on the screen from the technical team. There we are. So, looks like there's a slight favour. We're slightly in favour generally. So we are 26% very comfortable, 33% somewhat comfortable. But on the other hand, we are 25% somewhat uncomfortable and 8% very uncomfortable. So I think we're still in the balance, but we're slightly in favour of them at the moment. So we'll see perhaps if that changes following our discussion. So let's get started with that. And let me introduce the panel. Four great speakers, and I'm delighted to introduce, first of all, Emma Gibson, who's the CEO at London Travel Watch. Thank you so much, Emma, for sponsoring this work and for joining us today. Thanks. I'd also like to welcome the Chief Superintendent, Simon Ovens, Road and Transport Policing Command at the Metropolitan Police Service. Thank you for coming to engage on this issue, Simon. Next, we have Helen Sharp, who's the e-scooter trial lead at Transport for London. It's great to have you with us. And finally, we're excited to have Haran Tillanathan, who is a member of the London Sight Loss Council, join us. We're very glad to have your perspective on the panel, Haran. So just a reminder to the audience, if you want to engage in the discussion, please use the chat function and the Q&A function also to submit your questions to be asked at the end. I'd like to start with Emma, first of all, to really kind of lay out where we're going with e-scooters as a transport solution, right? So if we work, Helen, on, sorry, Emma, if we work on the premise that e-scooters can't be uninvented, then what kind of measures are being explored at the moment to make them work better for everyone?
Thanks, Callum. I mean, I think you're right that they can't be uninvented. I think that's where we are now, and we've got to live with them and work out how we can make them work. But first of all, I wondered whether I could just talk a little bit about what the kind of feedback is that we get from people using transport in London, because as a transport user watchdog, we get a lot. And the views on e-scooters are really quite polarised. So, for example, on the one hand, I get young men asking me what I'm doing to make sure that they get legalised as soon as possible. And on the other hand, I probably get more contact from people who are telling me that they're an absolute menace, that they've nearly been knocked down on the street, especially when they're ridden on pavements. And a lot of those people are women, and they're also people who are blind or partially sighted. And I think it's really important to listen to the views of people who are telling you that a new technology is making things worse for them. And at London Travel Watch, we increasingly are finding ourselves over the last couple of years advocating for groups of people who find themselves being excluded by technical innovation, like, for example, the move to kind of remove cash when paying for transport. And, you know, we know that London's transport system hasn't been designed around the needs of women. And we know that disabled people face many everyday barriers to getting out and about around town. And so we mustn't let the enthusiasm for new technology, any kind of new technology, affect our ability to listen to the people who are telling us that they're being left behind. And the whole reason this webinar came about was because I read Centre for London's report on e-scooters and micromobility a few months ago that Josh was talking about, and I nearly fell off my chair when I read the recommendation that they should be allowed to be ridden on pavements. And so I rang up Centre for London, and as a result of the conversation we had, we said, why don't we put on this webinar together and talk about this? And, you know, can we make e-scooters work for everybody? And if so, how can we make that happen? So do you want me to come back to the point about, you know, they can't be uninvented and
yeah, absolutely. And just really, if you can, from what you're seeing, you know, do you think at this stage we can say that the benefits outweigh the challenges, I suppose?
I think it's a really, I'm hoping this discussion will help us to answer some of those questions. And I think possibly there are some things that can be done. So I would, and you know, the issues are different with rental e-scooters and private e-scooters. And I think that's really important to explore in this session. But if I could just say kind of, you know, 3 things that would make a difference, I think, and there are many, 3 of many, but if I could just pick 3, first of all, don't let them be ridden on the pavement under any circumstances. Number 2, I'm really interested in the suggestion by the Urban Transport Group that the private scooters could be licensed in the way that, say, drones are if you own a drone. So you have to have an operator ID, so you can trace riders who are riding unsafely or involved in crime, for example. So I think there's stuff that you can do around regulation. And I think thirdly, let's learn from the countries that are ahead of us on this. So for example, you know, a lot of the e-scooters have small wheels, so they're really susceptible for people being kind of thrown off when they hit a pothole. And so some countries are making their e-scooters much larger and much sturdier, and that's making them safer. So I think it is possible that we could make them work for everybody, but it really depends how we go about it.
Thanks so much, Emma. Let's bring in Helen from TfL here. Helen, I'm really interested. We've been talking a lot about the reactions that we've got from the general public, and I think I get a similar kind of story in my inbox, my email inbox, as a transport journalist, I have to say. Helen, what have we learned so far from the e-scooter trials, and who is using e-scooters? Have you got any context on that?
Yeah, thanks, and thanks for inviting me to take part in the panel. I definitely agree. My inbox probably looks the same as most people's on this call, of very different views, even on the rental trials as well. I think at the moment we're in learning mode, and that's probably the main thing to really highlight, is the trials around the country, including the trial that's running in London. Their main purpose is to collect data and to form that evidence base to go back to the DfT to then shape kind of what that future standard and regulation looks like. And I think given where we now are with kind of the clarity on the government's intent to legalise e-scooters, the trials are more important than ever to use that ability to collect the data, to see how things are going, and to kind of test and learn as we go. I think in terms of what we're learning, there's probably a couple of categories that I can touch on. We're learning a lot, but I think there's also still a lot that we still need to learn. And I think that's the main point of we should never kind of stop trying to improve. We're definitely not perfect. There's things that we can change and do better on. And that's where we need to keep going with the kind of extensive stakeholder engagement that we run. We need those opinions to be able to kind of better shape what we're doing. And the operators that we work with in London are equally very open to that. I'll take the big one, safety. So I think you need to kind of look at safety from a couple of different angles. Everyone obviously focuses on the safety of the vehicles themselves. You can also focus on the safety and the behaviours and the way of riding a scooter from those that are using it. You can focus on the safety and kind of the interactions with other road users, pedestrians, and kind of motorised vehicles as well, also with cyclists. So I think it's just always worth kind of bearing in mind slightly different angles for that. Coming back to the comment that both Emma and Josh have kind of stated already, I think if we go about it in the right way, with the right standards and regulations in place, we can ensure that the vehicles are safe. We can ensure that they are used, in a considerate manner. And I do think that the rental trials, certainly in London, are proving that that is possible. We then need to start to, continue to build on that, and technology plays a role, but I think we need to be careful about how much we rely on technology to do certain things. So yes, we can use the technology to control where the scooter is going, where it shouldn't be ridden, but that technology is still quite young. And I do think we need to just kind of use it in moderation and use it in addition to kind of other solutions that are in place.
I just want to, it's quite interesting. When we were talking about the Elizabeth line, I heard the word world beating a lot, and I think we've touched on, Josh mentioned previously about managing it at city level. Have you done benchmarking with other trials around the UK and benchmarking perhaps with similar cities around the world? I'm really interested to see how you've gone about that.
Yeah, so I wouldn't go as far as saying that we've kind of benchmarked ourselves against others, because our measure of success is, do we collect enough data to inform kind of what the future standards should be? And benchmarking would generally look at, trip numbers, injury statistics, maybe demographics, maybe access to different user groups, that sort of thing. What we are doing, though, is having kind of quite regular conversations with other cities that are running trials. So the Combined Authority for the West of England, Transport for West Midlands. And generally what we're finding is everyone's got the same challenges and no one's got the answer. So that dialogue needs to continue to happen. I sit within the innovation team within TfL. and we do speak to other cities on a really regular basis. I used to sit within Santander Cycles as my kind of previous role, and we're very frequently talking to other cities about kind of what we do. The approach to regulation is quite an interesting one. The e-scooter trial in London, and I'm sure if anyone from Lime or Tier is listening, it's quite heavily regulated. We've got a lot of control. We set really high standards. We are on it every day, making sure that the operators are doing as much as they can, that the boroughs that are taking part are equally kind of helping and complementing with that. But yeah, there is definitely an opportunity to learn from others. Ireland's an interesting case at the moment. They're about at the same stage, trying to kind of get that legislation through. But yeah, there's lots of opportunities to learn. I think, you know, with other cities, they've generally gone big and then have had to scale back. You know, they've had 20 different operators in cities in Sweden, and then they've kind of scaled back and they've realized actually, and it comes back to the city having the ability to determine who operates in what scale over what geography. You know, those are really fundamental points that we need to make sure that the ability to make those decisions is kind of with the right level of strategic authority.
Absolutely. And putting just on the point of safety, want to just make a little clarification on the Centre for London position. I think there in the micromobility report it calls for segregation, but not necessarily e-scooters on pavement. So I just want to just clarify that point. Moving on to the enforcement and sort of around and you know, have we got the data on you know, the safety data in terms of intervention? Simon, I'd like to bring you in at this point. Could you talk about what if you've got any kind of like top level statistics and sort of evidence on how the Met has operated in this e-scooter trial?
Sure. Hello, everybody. I mean, rather than concentrate on statistics, and I've been looking at all the chat going on, the various figures being thrown around, I think we should just concentrate maybe on the bigger issue. And I think we've got a real emperor new clothes situation here, where hope meets reality, in that there are loads of good points around green, the green future of London and transport infrastructure, etc. But we have a situation where these e-scooters, they're just not fit for the road in the way they're currently designed, either in their lack of brakes, lights, suspension, turning circle, and all the other things, but also in the way that they're ridden. I mean, I live in London, I go around London, working, not working, and we just see the general disregard and the way these things are ridden. So I was interested in some of the comments by, I think, local authority elected members that say it's one of the things they get lots of complaints about. And it's people like local councillors and people like me and my officers who are actually in touch with the people that are also going to trying to get around London as well. So I actually welcome Emma Gibson's comments that, okay, they may be here to stay, but it doesn't mean that the concept may be here to stay, but it doesn't mean the current technology is the right technology, and we should be leaping ahead to actually legalise them as they stand at the moment. Many of them don't have brakes. They certainly don't have proper suspension. We know that the deaths of 17 people have been killed across the country in the last 2 or 3 years on them. We know most of those are because people have fallen off or hitting small bumps on the road and that type of thing as well. So my point is that as they currently are, and they're just not safe for the road. Helen's trial has been really useful, and we went out of our way to support that, to see how we might inform any government decision in the future to legalise them. Emma mentioned pavements and licensing and larger bikes. I'd certainly add headgear to that, because we know that, again, most of the injuries, most of the deaths have been caused by people falling off, hitting their heads and injuring themselves. But more than that, we've got all these poor people on the pavements, where people dashing around. Particularly, I have a blind sister. She has had a number of incredibly close scrapes, because you can't hear these things coming, and they're not observing traffic lights and on the pavement and all of that. So my point is the current technology is not working. It's not fit for purpose. The concept of an electrical vehicle that we might get around London is not an anathema. I think that's fine. But if we're going to go for some sort of electric powered two-wheeled vehicle, they need to be very different from the way they are at the moment.
I just wonder, when you walk around the city, I walked down Caledonian Road the other day, and you've got an e-scooter cafe and clinic there. You go down the Edgware Road, you see there's all. I think there's a real kind of like a culture around e-scooters, and to some people that's great, and to some people, there's a perception issue, and all these issues of safety are concerning. I just wonder, is there a sort of a gap or a disconnect between the culture and the reality? And do you think, in a way, the sort of the perception sort of harms their future? If they're seen as sort of are they actually a tool for antisocial behaviour, or is that not the case?
Well, first of all, we should recognise that many more millions of people don't ride these things and do ride them around London. So perhaps we need to look after the silent majority there as well. Your point on crime is that, yeah, there are, in fact, over 20 to 21, their use in crime actually trebled. It went up from 300 reported incidents to nearly 1,000 reported incidents. So apart from the theft of them themselves, their biggest use is in street robberies and snatches on the street as well. But we're also getting lots of reports of antisocial behaviour as well. It's about the way they're ridden and what they're used for, isn't it? And because they're ridden badly and used for crime, they get a bad reputation. But I go back to my point that as they are at the moment, without brakes largely, without lights largely, without proper suspension largely, they're not fit to be on our roads.
Sure. Just keeping on with that point of the perception, I want to bring in Haran here. Haran, is it a big issue? I mean, you cover accessibility across all transport modes. Are e-scooters genuinely a common cause for concern? What are you hearing?
Hi, and thank you for having me along to this event. Yes, I think it's definitely a concern that's been raised by a number of our members and members of the community in London, but across, as was mentioned, there are trials going across the country, and as we've also seen the genie's out the bottle almost in terms of private e-scooters, so their uptake has risen massively, possibly alongside the trials and possibly as a result as well, as you can imagine, from a blind and partially sighted perspective, you've got a form of transport that is silent, potentially can be ridden very fast and of considerable weight, and then on top of that, you're also at the moment you're largely reliant on the conduct of the person riding the scooter. And I think in all of this, we can look at the statistics and the data, and you might assure yourself in terms of incidents and accidents, injuries, and in rare events fatalities, that I think that tells you one part of the picture. But particularly for a lot of blind and partially sighted people, I think it's also the perception of what's happening out there as well, and how electric scooters are feeding into that. And while I think a lot of the discussion, we've been talking about, which we recognise the contribution micromobility and electric forms of transportation will have in decarbonisation and sustainability. We've also just been through 2 years of the pandemic, which, as you can imagine, for groups such as the blind and partially sighted and other groups, that they've been probably, I would say, disproportionately impacted in terms of their, our ability to come out and engage with society. And we're coming out of this period now where we're all obviously keen to return to life as normal, but factors such as electric scooters do add to the anxiety and the confidence of people, blind and partially sighted people, to come out. So, you know, and certainly in London, whether you're within a trial borough or not, more than likely you'll be encountering people riding scooters. You know, I can speak for myself. I've been in parks and on pavements, and I will, you know, fortunately I've got a guide dog, and you know, I've probably got a bit more warning, but you know, I often won't know there's an electric scooter there until it's almost right by me. You know, some occasionally you'll have someone shouting out or making a sound, but yeah, it definitely feeds in. So I would say electric scooters do sort of feed into overall perceptions of risk and safety, particularly for blind and partially sighted pedestrians.
And what do you think then should happen next as we're moving forward? Are there any sort of recommendations that you'd like to give in how we can make them more accessible?
Yeah, so I think I can't remember who made the observation. I think when we think about this, I would agree that we probably should distinguish between the rental e-scooters and private e-scooters, and you know, the private scooters, you know, really are at the moment, I think, largely the sort of Wild West in terms of how they're bought and operated. We're obviously, it'd be interesting to see the data and conclusions coming out of the trial. I think and there probably a couple, you know, there will be things we can improve on around that. I think for private e-scooters, first and foremost, I think we should be taking a principles-led approach, particularly on safety. So some of the things have already been mentioned around design and construction of the scooters, you know, the maximum speeds they can do, the weight. I don't think it's been mentioned before, but obviously for the blind and partially sighted, acoustic warnings are important. So there's something called AVAS, I think it's the Advanced Vehicle Alert System. So, you know, some sort of sound that you know, allows us to know there's an e-scooter coming that way. And we, you know, ideally, I know trials on that are going on at the moment. And if we could have a sort of a universal sound, that would be excellent. So there's sort of the design and construction of the scooters. Then there's also the conduct of, you know, how they're operated, and I would wholeheartedly agree. Absolutely, they shouldn't be on the pavements. I'm not sure at the moment I've seen the rationale or any justification as to why they would need to be on the pavements. And effectively, we would sort of like to see, you know, I think at the moment electric scooters are effectively a form of motor transport, and we would expect to see them regulated and enforced accordingly. So, you know, if we're thinking about legislation, then, you know, we would expect to see points around that. And then the final area is about the point of sale. Obviously, at the moment, you know, I think there's a token sort of requirement for retailers to make buyers, you know, aware of the legal status of electric scooters and how they should be operated, but you know, it's very, very minimal. So some of the things that have been touched on there about licensing and registration, ideally we'd like to see that in at the point of sale. You know, people, as with the rental scooters, being required to have at least a provisional driving license, and then also, you know, obviously that brings the added problem of you know, you can buy an electric scooter in the shop, whether you've also got online retailers and how you approach them as well. But those would be the three areas, I think, particularly in legislation, that we'd be looking around private scooters.
Thank you. Just looking at the questions that are coming in on the questions section. There's a lot of discussion about sort of like modal shift and sort of how we can integrate e-scooters into the wider transport system. Perhaps Helen, you might like to touch on that. You know, where are e-scooter users coming from? Do you have any insight on that?
Yeah, sure. So I think the main thing, just to reference, obviously, for a lot of the data collection for the trials is actually going directly to the DFT. And the DFT are doing, obviously, the national evaluation program, and that will include things like mode shift, demographic data, accessibility data as well. For London, we definitely know that there is a decent amount of demand for the rental e-scooters. We've just hit 1 million trips. That is a significant milestone in terms of being able to give us good data. In terms of kind of how they're being used, I think mode shift itself, personally, I don't think it's the best metric to be able to look at, especially in kind of London's context, where actually people's travel patterns are quite complex. Mode shift's quite binary. We're also looking at a trial at the moment that is in central London boroughs where car ownership is actually very low. And we're also kind of centered in an area of London where public transport and kind of PTAL scores is super high. All that said, we do know that people are switching away from cars. We do know that people are switching away from active travel. And we do know that people are switching away from public transport. All of those things are going to be true. But I think what we're trying to do is figure out, and this is where the trials are key, is figuring out kind of what role e-scooters should play. How do they complement the public transport system? They are going to be part and parcel of the future transport mix. We just need to kind of better understand exactly what that looks like. Yes, they're used for leisure trips and for fun, but they are also used for commuting purposes. We've got really clear kind of morning and AM peaks in the data, and when people are choosing to use them. So yeah, we're starting to kind of build up a much better picture of how rental e-scooters specifically will kind of fit into the future of London's kind of cityscape.
Sure. Emma, I want to bring you in here. So is there the fact that the trial is ongoing creates a sort of grey area for people, and just from a sort of quote unquote consumer perspective, does that kind of prolong a sense of hesitation? Is there any trend or any feedback that you've seen?
I mean, I think a lot of people are still trying to make their minds up about e-scooters. And they can see them, people who get mailbags like London Travel Watch can see the perspectives on both sides, and they're trying to kind of balance that out. And I think it was the parliamentary committee PAX was saying actually it's not enough just to evaluate the data from the e-scooter trials. You've also got to add in data from the private e-scooters as well and how those are being used. And so I think it probably is good that we still spend time talking about some of these issues, and maybe in the same kind of timeline that the government's looking at bringing in legislation to regulate them, because I think there are lots of suggestions here, and I'm looking on the chat as well, about how e-scooters could be made better, be made safer. And if we really did do that properly, then I think we could come out with a bit of legislation at the end of the process in the transport bill that does really make them work for more people. So I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to kind of take the time to get this right. But obviously, in the meantime, we have got, especially on the private e-scooters, some of them being driven, unsafely, making the streets less accessible to some people. And that is problematic. And of course, the police force in London have finite resources, so they can't go around on every bit of pavement, policing people to make sure that they're riding responsibly and not putting off other users. But I think it's not a bad thing to have serious conversations like this and kind of working together to say, what are the shared solutions that can make it work for everybody.
Thank you so much. And there it's 10:40. So we're going to now move to our second poll, and then we're going to have an audience Q&A where the conversation will continue. Just a reminder that you can use the hashtag London eScooters to get involved, and our team are looking out for questions as well. So if the CFL technical team can flash up the second poll, that would be appreciated. And the question is, After hearing about the discussion, how confident do you feel that e-scooters can be managed to work for everyone in the future? So we are going to have, there we are, there it is. There are your options again, and we want to see if there's been a difference. So very confident, somewhat confident, neither confident nor unconfident, somewhat confident, or very very unconfident even. And we'll share the results before we wrap up the event. So I'm just going through now the questions. And I want to start with this question from Rachel Brody, and I'm going to put it to Simon, if that's okay. So she says, are you able to differentiate between privately owned e-scooters and child e-scooters in the participation of crime? I just want to hear your thoughts on that, please.
Well, no, I don't think the my stats are sophisticated enough on that. We'd have to do some cross checking. But what I would say is that the ones in the trial, we were really pleased that the manufacturers and the operators spoke to us before, and we were able to help them make some moderation. So clearly the ones in the trial are safer. They're also numbered and licensed, and by and large we will know who's on them at any time. So there is bound to be less use of them in crime, because unless people are going to try and get into hacking and stuff, and we know there's been some of that, they're being used in a licensed and regulated way. What we need to concentrate on are the vast majority of the ones out there are unlicensed and private. People are saying, well, how many people use cars and stuff? But if we had car manufacturers selling cars openly that were unfit for the road, there'd be uproar. It just wouldn't happen, would it? And yet we have many suppliers. I can phone up, order one, and one can arrive on my doorstep probably the same day these days as well, and it's just not fit for the road, and off I go and use it without any qualifications, insurance, etc. Now all of that is illegal, not the supply but the use of them. And there was a time that we were seizing in London about 1,000 a month, illegal ones being taken off the road. There's been a discussion about brakes and stuff. A lot of them don't have brakes, they just stand on the back wheel. Some of them have brakes, rudimentary brakes, but none of them that will be compliant with constructions and use regulations. So in answer to the question, clearly it's private ones that are being used mainly in crime, because we have no idea who's on it and who it belongs to, and then being passed around, etc. Hope that helps.
Certainly does, thank you. Lorna Stevenson asks this question. I think it's quite interesting there. As we move towards legalization, who beyond transport do we need to speak for private ownership? For private ownership to be successful? Helen, perhaps.
Yeah, so I think as generally as there is that kind of move towards legislation and the regulation and the secondary legislation that's going to need to be passed, I think there is going to be a period of consultation. So, you know, that consultation, I'm noting a few comments in the chat about, you know, is it working for everyone kind of the right benchmark? And I think we can get close to that, but I don't think we're gonna ever sort of hit that. But yeah, I think the consultation is important. I think one of the key things that we've really tried to do for the rental trial is to have a really kind of broad engagement program, lots of different stakeholders involved. And I think it's just important to kind of say, you know, explain what we're doing, why we're doing it, also explain what we're not doing and why we're not doing it. And just giving people the chance to feed into it. I think the situation obviously at the moment, you know, we've all said it in various different ways, just doesn't work. It's going to be difficult to harness views of those that own private e-scooters and regularly use private e-scooters because of the legal status currently. You know, people are going to try and, you know, survey things or but yeah, I think it is going to be difficult to kind of harness that view. But I'm sure Emma's probably got some pretty good ideas as to how we can just make sure that those views are incorporated.
Absolutely. And just before we go to that, if I could ask a great question here from Jim Hubbard, and he says, what's the biggest surprise that you've seen from the London trial, and what would you hope to be improved upon on the future?
That's a tough one. I'll take the second bit first. So there are definitely things that we want to continue to improve and work on. We've just announced that we're extending London's trial through to November in line with the DfT. And that kind of gives us the opportunity to do a couple of things. It gives us the opportunity to continue to collect data, to plug any gaps that we think we've got, and also to kind of continue to test and learn. One of the areas that we really want to continue to focus on is parking density. There isn't enough parking in London at the moment for the trial to be able to reach its potential. We're not yet at the point where you've kind of got that viable alternative to the car effectively, because you're walking roughly 5 minutes to find a scooter in a designated bay. You're riding that scooter on average for about 17 minutes, and then you're doing another 5 minute, plus walk at the other end. That's not that convenient. So we're not going to ever see at the moment kind of the true potential. So parking is a big one. AVAS has been mentioned. The 3 operators in London are working with Pearl, the research facility, to see whether there is a universal sounds that we can develop. It is very early days. It comes back to my point about technology and trying to get the benefit of technology, but also using it in the right way. And we are looking to see whether we can use the period of the extension of the trial to maybe do some on-street testing. Again, extensive engagement will kind of be in place to be able to do that and get it right. And it is going to be a tricky one to get right. The biggest surprise, I guess we didn't go into it with any preconceived ideas, because the whole point is just to learn. So I wouldn't really say that anything's been particularly surprising. I think everything is challenging. We have a bit of a joke sort of within the team that sort of you put e-scooters and you generally say, it's difficult or it's challenging or it's tricky. And they always seem to be in the same sentence. But yeah, I think we've got a lot still to learn. We've got really good partnerships and engagement in place. We've got to get that balance right between sort of innovation and regulation, and we're probably not quite there yet. And we've got to let the right people do the right aspects of the trial. Those that know certain areas of things have got to be let to show their influence and their expertise. So that's what we're going to try and focus on.
Thank you. I want to go to a question now from Lewis Oldfield, and I think I'm going to put this one to Emma. Given that there's a cost of living crisis, I think this might be a little bit of an elephant in the room, and I think it's important to say. He says one of the reasons that private e-scooters seem to be very popular amongst young people and people on low incomes are that they are simply cheap. And if legalized, additional measures and requirements to make the e-scooters safer, such as better braking, suspension registration, is likely to drive up the cost of the vehicle, and ownership may exclude some users. Do you have any evidence or any thoughts on this? I'd love to hear.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think e-scooters are particularly cheap. I think they're about kind of 300 quid for a reasonable model. So no, I don't have loads to say about that, but I do know that when we were involved in a campaign to save free bus travel for under 18s at the start of the pandemic, we spoke to quite a lot of kind of young people of school age who were saying, I have to get the bus. People are saying, why don't I get a bike? I can't afford a bike. So I think you can kind of look both ways on that. You might say over the course of the year, I could save money by buying an e-scooter, but you might not have the upfront money to buy the vehicle in the first place. So I think that you could look either way on that one.
Sure thing. Thank you. Let's go to a question now from Dom Cotton, who simply says, can the panel give their views on the wearing of helmets on e-scooters? Simon, you touched on this briefly. Let's bring you back in.
absolute fundamental requirement should they be legalised in any form whatsoever in the future, I would say.
Thank you. Actually, let's go around the panel. Harren, thoughts?
Well, I guess they're primarily there for the safety of the rider. It would seem like an obvious requirement to have.
Thank you. Helen?
Definitely to be encouraged, but I think it's personal choice, and I think it depends on where e-scooters end up with the classification according to either kind of e-bikes or pedal bikes, and just keeping things in proportion. So yeah.
Emma?
Thumbs up for me on helmets. Just sounds like a very sensible thing.
Sounds good. Let's go to
Marius. Can I just make one more comment? Yeah,
sure.
no. The Met Police are thoroughly signed up to the Mayor's Vision Zero, which is about stopping all road death on the streets of London. Every person that gets killed on a pedal cycle or on an e-scooter, invariably it's head injuries that my colleagues in London hospitals are telling me that are killing them. It would just be crazy to, should these be legalised, not to make that a fundamental requirement to get onto an e-scooter.
Thank you. Helen, just want to pick back up. A few of the questions or a few of the comments kind of touch on cycling. Do you think that, for instance, the difference between e-bikes and e-scooters have created a sort of grey area there? And has there been a negative impact or a positive impact on cycling from what you've seen? I'm sure people are going to comment about this.
So I know that obviously cycle hire, as it stands, is kind of going from strength to strength. We've had really record numbers over the last couple of years. We've seen, you know, if there's any kind of positive to take from the pandemic, is the fact that a lot of people have taken up cycling, and the cycle schemes, and obviously the ability to get access to bikes is key, to be able to provide that. What do you mean by sort of the differences between e-bikes and e-scooters? What's that reference to?
I think perhaps in terms of from a consumer perspective, you know, there are extra there's extra sort of friction to e-scooters than there are to e-bikes, and you know, e-bikes are a lot more accessible, shall we say?
Yeah, but there's regulation that's already in place for e-bikes. There are construction and use standards. There are terms and conditions associated with hiring of e-bikes, whether that be the dockless e-bikes that you see in London and other cities. So yeah, I think there probably is a blurred line, but I think in terms of regulation, that the pitch is actually quite clear, that they are different at the moment. They will ultimately end up in this kind of broader umbrella category that the legislation has kind of talked about. But there are going to be, you know, specific differences for different types of modes.
A question from Sarah Gayton. Again, Helen, I think this one's for you. She says it was promised that rental e-scooters could not be parked on the pavement, but rental e-scooters are often being parked on pavements. How can we address that?
So there's a difference between being parked and being abandoned. We do, within the trial, use both footway and carriageway designated parking. That means they're lined and signed appropriately. The participating boroughs generally are determining kind of where the parking is for e-scooters. And that's one of the things that we're looking at in terms of kind of what works better. Does it work better to be on the footway or the carriageway? There are very clear views on that from different stakeholder groups. But yeah, at the moment we are using both, and it's dependent on the parking policy of the borough that's participating in the trial.
I'm going to throw this open to all the panel, so if anyone would like to comment on this. A question from Margaret Winchcombe, and she says, how does the panel respond to the statistics published by the DFT yesterday, with details of casualties in 2021. And she particularly points out that in the Metropolitan Police area, there were 510 collisions involving e-scooters, making up 38% of all casualties involving e-scooters in Great Britain. So perhaps there's a London-specific issue here. I imagine, Simon, you'll want to come in, but please, anyone.
Well, my reaction to the statistics is that, that's probably a vast underrepresentation of where we actually are. Most people are, when they fall off these e-scooters or are knocked off, don't report it because they're driving an illegal, riding an illegal vehicle unless they're part of the trial. They need insurance, they need a license, etc. So there will be an under-reporting there. But on those that are reported, I mean, it's pretty shocking, isn't it, that over 500 people in a year reported collisions with these. And as I say, 5 people have died over the last couple of years in London. We've had 2 extremely serious injuries in the last couple of days. And I pray for the recovery of those 2 people, but they're extremely serious injuries. And unless there's a fundamental change to the way e-scooters are designed, it's going to carry on.
Would anyone else like to come in on that? And is there a London-specific issue or problem, or any kind of closing comments there in terms of safety in particular?
Could I jump in there?
Yeah, sure.
So I think I would tend to agree. Just given the sheer numbers in terms of particularly the ratio of rental to private electric scooters, I suspect, unfortunately, that number probably does understate what's happening out there. I just also wanted to bring up, when we talk about safety, I know today we've talked a lot about the scooters in motion, but I think, as was raised by the previous question, there is also a genuine issue around scooters being docked or abandoned, and when particularly on the pavement, that does represent a significant obstruction for not only the blind and partially sighted, but anyone else in wheelchairs or with buggies. And they because of their size and bulk, if you do encounter them and unfortunate to fall over them or can't get around them, that is another key sort of threat to or risk to safety as well that we all need to look at going forwards.
Thank you so much. I think we're just coming up on 11 o'clock, so we're going to wrap things up now. But before we go, let's share the results of the second poll, if we can do that now. I'd be interested to see if there's been any change. I think, interesting. I think we've got slightly more confident, which is interesting, actually. So we're now at 23% very confident, 38% somewhat confident, so that's slightly higher. 10% neither confident nor unconfident. Somewhat unconfident is at 20% and 9% very unconfident. So I think there's been a slight positive increase there, which is interesting. I think it's been a very useful discussion. I think safety, I think, remains a challenge. I think safety remains a hurdle, but I think, judging by the results of that, I think that there is momentum to see e-scooters really become integrated to London's transport ecosystem, really. And it'll be interesting to see, and I'm sure the Centre for London will follow up with plenty more. Just want to say, I really enjoyed the opportunity to spend some time to reflect deeply and engage in such a significant conversation about this innovative and sustainable form of transportation in London. Do carry on the debate online using the hashtag London e-scooters, and you can download, really important, please do have a read, really useful, the micromobility in London report on the Centre for London website, which Josh alluded to earlier. Take some time to read it in full and do share it widely amongst your networks. If you've enjoyed today's event, do take a look at Centre for London's current projects, which cover topics like homelessness and temporary accommodation, low traffic neighbourhoods, and levelling up. And if you're interested in partnering with them in any way, please do reach out. So a big thank you to Emma, to Harren, to Helen, and for Simon for taking part in this discussion, and from me, Callum, Marius, thank you ever so much for joining us. And that's a wrap. Thank you.